It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Julian Thorne laughed as he tossed a stack of stained reports onto Cassandra Vance's lap during the executive gala. The red wine he'd accidentally tipped seconds earlier was already soaking through the white silk of her gown, a blooming crimson stain that looked like a fresh wound. "My apologies, Cassandra," he said, though his voice held nothing but sharp, jagged edges of amusement. "I suppose I was just so distracted by the sheer incompetence in your latest quarterly projections that my hand slipped." The ballroom of the Vance estate, usually a sanctuary of refined elegance, suddenly felt like a cage. Marcus Reed, Julian's shadow and vice president of operations, let out a staged, wheezing chuckle from behind his boss. At the head of the nearby lounge area, Beatrice Vance watched the scene unfold. The family matriarch didn't move to intervene. She simply tightened her grip on her silver-headed cane, her eyes narrowed with a cold, calculating judgment that stung worse than the wine. Cassandra didn't gasp. She didn't jump up to scrub at the fabric or offer a frantic apology for being in his way. She simply looked down at the ruined silk, then up at the man who had been trying to dismantle her since the day her father's heart had given out. The sharp, metallic scent of Julian's expensive cologne clashing with the floral notes of the centerpieces made her stomach turn, but her face remained a mask of marble. "The projections are accurate, Julian," she said, her voice a low, steady hum that betrayed nothing of the fire licking at her ribs. "Perhaps the distraction lies in your inability to read beyond the first page." Julian leaned in, the smell of aged scotch rolling off him in waves. He was a man built on expensive tailoring and unearned confidence, his face already flushing with the cocktail of power and alcohol. "Do you know what people are saying, Cassandra? They're saying the Iron Orchid has finally wilted. They're saying you've become soft. This isn't a charity, it's a legacy. A legacy you're drowning in your own sentimentality." He reached out, his thumb grazing the damp fabric near her collarbone with a familiarity that made her skin crawl. "Maybe it's time you stepped aside. Go find a nice garden to tend to. Leave the heavy lifting to men who don't bleed heartstrings every time they have to make a budget cut." Marcus Reed nodded fervently. "He's right, you know. The board is getting restless. They want results, not empathy initiatives." Cassandra's fingers drifted to the small evening clutch resting on the velvet cushion beside her. Inside, tucked into a hidden seam, was a small, encrypted thumb drive. It was cold to the touch, a tiny weight of pure, unadulterated truth. Leo Sterling had risked everything to get it out of the maintenance archives, and she could feel its presence like a loaded weapon. Wait for it, she told herself, the words a mantra in her mind. Let him think he's won. Let him get comfortable in his arrogance. "I appreciate your concern for my well-being, Julian," she said, her eyes tracking a waiter moving through the crowd. It was Leo. He was dressed in the crisp black and white of the catering staff, his face obscured by the professional mask of service. As he passed their table, he subtly adjusted his tray, the silver reflecting the chandelier light directly into Julian's eyes for a split second. A signal. The data was verified. The fraud wasn't just a suspicion anymore. It was a map of Julian's greed. Julian blinked, annoyed by the flash of light, and turned his vitriol back to her. "Don't patronize me. I'm giving you a graceful way out. Resign tonight, citing personal reasons, and I'll make sure the buyout is generous. Refuse, and I'll make sure the board strips you of everything, including the Vance name." He stood up, looking down at her with the casual disdain one might show a broken piece of furniture. The sound of his heavy, polished Oxfords echoed against the marble floor as he began to walk away, Marcus trailing behind like a loyal dog. "2 days, Cassandra," Julian called over his shoulder, not even bothering to look back. "The board meeting is in 48 hours. Have your letter ready, or I'll have your replacement sitting in your chair before the coffee is served." Cassandra watched them go, her gaze lingering on the back of Julian's expensive tuxedo. She felt the weight of the room shifting, the whispers of the guests, the cold stare of Beatrice, the suffocating pressure of a legacy under siege. She could see the board members across the room, their heads huddled together as they glanced her way, their loyalty already fraying under Julian's careful manipulation. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small lace handkerchief. She didn't use it on her dress. Instead, she wiped a stray drop of wine from the surface of her clutch, her movements precise and lethal. The fabric of her gown was cold against her skin, a constant reminder of the humiliation he'd tried to heap upon her. But beneath the silk, her heart beat with a rhythmic, predatory steadiness. 2 days, she whispered to the empty air. She wasn't looking for a garden to tend to. She was preparing to burn his world to the ground, and for the first time in months, she knew exactly where to drop the match. Julian Thorne thought he was the hunter, but he had no idea he'd just handed the Iron Orchid the keys to his own destruction. Cassandra rose from her seat, ignoring the stairs, and walked toward the exit. She had a phone call to make, and a very different kind of projection to prepare. The next morning, the sun bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Vance building, but the warmth didn't reach Cassandra's office. She sat behind her mahogany desk, her thumb tracing the rim of a porcelain cup. The coffee inside was stone cold, much like the expression she wore as she stared at the internal memo flashing on her monitor. Julian Thorne hadn't wasted a second. By 8:00 a.m., he had circulated a wellness announcement to the entire executive floor. The prose was dripping with mock concern, suggesting that Cassandra Vance was taking a much-needed leave of absence following her emotional display at the gala. He was gaslighting an entire corporation before the janitors had even finished buffing the marble floors. A soft knock at the door broke her focus. Leo Sterling entered, carrying a toolbox and wearing the charcoal-gray jumpsuit of the building's maintenance crew. To anyone passing in the hall, he was just another face in the machinery of the skyscraper. To Cassandra, he was the sharpest forensic mind she'd ever hired. "The air conditioning in the server room is acting up again," Leo said, his voice low and steady. He set the toolbox on her carpet, the metallic clank echoing in the silent room. He didn't look at her, he looked at the thermostat on the wall. "I had to go deep into the vents to find the blockage." Cassandra rose and walked toward him, her heels clicking with predatory precision. "And what did you find, Leo?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted flash drive, sliding it onto the shelf beside the thermostat. "Julian isn't just skimming. He's been using Marcus Reed to create shell companies that buy our own debt. He thinks he's consolidating power to force a buyout at the board meeting. He has no idea the trail leads directly to his personal Cayman's account." Cassandra felt a spark of cold electricity. She touched the small drive, the plastic casing cool against her skin. "He's predictable. He thinks a wine stain and a few rumors are enough to break a woman like me." "He's arrogant," Leo agreed, finally meeting her eyes. "He's already planning the victory party. I saw Maya Sterling this morning before I came in. She asked if you were okay. Even a child can see the tension in this building." "Tell Maya I'm more than okay," Cassandra said, her voice dropping an octave. "I'm prepared." She dismissed him with a nod and headed toward the elevator. She needed to see the lion in his den. The doors opened on the 42nd floor to the sound of laughter. Julian stood in the center of the glass-walled lounge, flanked by a group of junior VPs. Marcus Reed was at his side, holding a tablet and nodding like a bobblehead at every word Julian uttered. The air in the lounge smelled of expensive cologne and the ozone of high-end electronics. "And then," Julian was saying, his voice booming with entitled glee, "she just stood there, dripping with Merlot, looking like a drowned cat. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost." The laughter died instantly as Cassandra stepped into the room. The silence was heavy, a physical weight that pressed against the lungs of everyone present. Julian Thorne turned, a slow, oily smirk spreading across his face. He adjusted his silk tie, his eyes raking over her conservative navy suit with visible disdain. "Cassandra, I thought you'd be home resting. After last night's instability, the board was quite worried." "The board is always worried about the bottom line, Julian," she replied, her voice as calm as a frozen lake. "I'm here to ensure they have the correct data." Marcus Reed shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting toward the elevators. We were just reviewing the quarterly projections, Cassandra. The numbers aren't looking great for your division. Numbers can be manipulated, Marcus. Truth is a bit more stubborn. She stepped closer to Julian, invading his personal space until he was forced to either back up or hold her gaze. He chose to puff out his chest. I've scheduled an emergency session for tomorrow at noon. I expect you to be there with the full audit reports. Julian laughed, a sharp, barking sound. Tomorrow? You're delusional. You don't have the standing to call an emergency session anymore. Not after I speak to Beatrice Vance this afternoon. Beatrice knows where my loyalties lie, Cassandra said. She leaned in, her voice a whisper meant only for him. Do you know where yours are, Julian? Or are they currently hidden in a shell company called Thorn Holdings? The color didn't leave his face, not yet, but his eyes flared with a sudden, sharp flicker of alarm. He covered it quickly with a sneer. I don't know what fairy tales you're spinning, but you're done here. Security will have your badge by 5. Cassandra didn't flinch. She simply turned on her heel, leaving him standing in the center of the room he thought he owned. As she walked away, she pulled her phone from her pocket and dialed a number she had memorized years ago. Beatrice, she said as the call connected. It's time, tomorrow at noon, and bring the legal team. We're going to discuss a vacancy in the VP's office. She hung up, her heart beating with the steady rhythm of a ticking clock. 24 hours. Julian Thorne had exactly 24 hours of luxury left before the world she had built for him turned into a cage. The following morning, the air in the sub-basement of Vance International smelled of damp concrete and the sharp, medicinal sting of industrial-grade floor wax. Cassandra Vance moved through the dimly lit corridors with a purpose that defied the shadows. She had traded her executive heels for a pair of silent, flat-soled boots, disappearing into the guts of the building she technically owned, but rarely visited. She found the maintenance workshop tucked behind a labyrinth of vibrating HVAC pipes. Inside, Leo Sterling was hunched over a workstation, his grease-stained jumpsuit a perfect disguise for a man who could dismantle a Fortune 500 company's ledger in his sleep. His daughter, Maya Sterling, sat on a nearby crate, swinging her legs while she colored in a notebook. The sight of the girl's innocence in this grimy, hidden world tightened something in Cassandra's chest. It was a reminder of why the stakes mattered. People like Julian Thorne didn't just steal money. They crushed the lives of those who actually did the work. You're early, Leo said, not looking up from the blue glow of a ruggedized laptop. The clock doesn't stop just because the sun goes down, Cassandra replied, her voice low. Do you have it? Leo tapped a final key and turned the screen. A complex web of digital transactions bloomed across the monitor, a constellation of red dots marking the flow of stolen capital. It's all here. Thorn Holdings isn't just a shell, it's a funnel. Julian has been siphoning the pension fund into offshore accounts for 18 months. He thought he was being clever by using fragmented transfers, but he left a digital fingerprint on the server logs every time he bypassed the encryption. He handed her a small, cold titanium flash drive. It felt heavier than its physical weight. This is the kill switch, Cassandra. It contains every authorization code he used, every time-stamped login, and the direct link to the accounts in the Caymans. It's not just fraud, it's grand larceny. Thank you, Leo, she said, tucking the drive into a hidden pocket of her blazer. Keep Maya safe. Once this starts, the fallout will be messy. We're used to the mess, Leo muttered, though his eyes softened as he looked at his daughter. Just make sure he doesn't walk away from this. He won't even see the wall until he hits it, she promised. He leaned back, propping his designer shoes on the desk. The leather creaked under his weight. By noon today, Beatrice will sign over the remaining voting rights. The Iron Orchid will be nothing more than a footnote in this company's history. I've already contacted the brokers. Once the merger goes through, we'll liquidate the manufacturing wing and move the assets. I'm thinking of a villa in Tuscany, maybe a yacht named the Conquest. And Cassandra? Marcus asked. Cassandra will be lucky if I let her keep her parking pass, Julian sneered. She thinks she can play in the deep end, but she's drowning. She doesn't realize that in this world, power isn't inherited, it's taken. He stood up, smoothing the front of his $3,000 suit. He checked his reflection in the glass of a framed award, adjusting his silk tie with the casual, toxic confidence of a man who had never faced a consequence he couldn't buy his way out of. Come on, let's not keep the board waiting. I want to see the look on her face when she realizes she's been evicted from her own empire. Cassandra stood in the executive elevator, the silence of the rising car absolute. She could feel the silk lining of her blazer against her skin, a soft contrast to the hard metal of the evidence resting against her hip. She wasn't the woman they had seen yesterday, the one who took the insults and the wine stains with a quiet nod. She was the architect now, and the blueprints for Julian's destruction were complete. Cassandra remained seated. She watched them leave, her expression unchanged. She knew what Julian didn't. Leo had finished the encryption bypass an hour ago. The janitor's logs were actually the digital breadcrumbs of every wire transfer Julian had authorized over the last 18 months. She felt a hand on her shoulder. Beatrice stood over her, her grip surprisingly firm. "He's arrogant," the older woman whispered, her voice like dry parchment. "Arrogance makes men blind, but it also makes them dangerous when they fall." "I know," Cassandra replied, looking at her reflection in the polished table. "That's why I'm going to make sure he doesn't see the ground until he hits it." She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city as the sun began to dip below the skyline. Tomorrow was the gala. The stage was set, the witnesses were invited, and the evidence was secured. She pulled her phone from her pocket and sent a single text to Leo. "Everything is in place. See you at the finish line." She stared at the screen until it went dark. There was no going back now. Tomorrow, the Vance name would either be saved or scorched to the earth, and she was the one holding the match. The evening of the Founders' Gala arrived with a calculated chill that rattled the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Vance Plaza ballroom. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of white gardenias and the metallic tang of expensive champagne. Crystal chandeliers vibrated with the low hum of the city's elite, their voices a synchronized murmur of projected power and carefully curated gossip. Julian Thorne stood at the center of the gilded room, the undisputed son of this particular solar system. He adjusted his silk tuxedo jacket, his movements fluid and practiced, the epitome of a man who believed the world had finally corrected its tilt in his favor. Marcus Reed hovered at his shoulder like a nervous shadow, clutching a flute of vintage crystal as if it were a life preserver. "She hasn't shown," Marcus whispered, his eyes darting toward the grand mahogany entrance. "Maybe she realized there's no point in a public execution." Julian laughed, a sharp, jagged sound that cut through the orchestral music. "Cassandra Vance is many things, Marcus, but she isn't a coward. She's likely at home, polishing the family silver she'll have to sell by next month. Or perhaps she's finally accepted that the Vance name is just a legacy of dust without the Thorne ambition to back it up." He turned to a passing board member, his voice rising just enough to be overheard by the surrounding circle. "It's a shame, really. Some people are built for the climb, and others are simply born at the peak, waiting for the inevitable fall." This was the first rage spike of the evening, the casual, public desecration of a century of work. The board member nodded in sycophantic agreement, a man who smelled the changing of the guard and wanted to be on the side with the keys. High above the floor, on the velvet-draped balcony, Beatrice Vance watched the display with a face carved from granite. Her gloved hand rested on the marble railing, her presence a silent, judging weight. She didn't move, didn't speak, but her eyes never left the man who was currently treating her family's history like a stepping stone. Then, the heavy doors at the far end of the ballroom swung open. The room didn't go silent all at once. It happened in waves, starting from the back and crashing toward the center. Cassandra entered not with the frantic energy of someone fighting for her life, but with the terrifying stillness of a predator that had already won. She wore a gown of midnight blue silk that seemed to absorb the light around her, cinched at the waist by a belt of interlocking silver scales. Her hair was swept back, exposing the sharp, aristocratic lines of her face. She didn't look like a woman on the verge of losing a company. She looked like the woman who owned the air they were breathing. As she moved through the crowd, the sea of black ties and silk dresses parted. She caught sight of Leo Sterling near the catering entrance, dressed in the crisp white uniform of the waitstaff. He didn't look at her directly, but as she passed, he adjusted the silver tray in his hand, a signal. The data was live. The feed was bridged. Cassandra reached into the small, structured clutch at her side, her fingers brushing the cold, rectangular edge of an encrypted drive. It was a secret power moment, a tactile reminder that Julian was currently standing on a trapdoor she had built with his own arrogance. "You're late, Cassandra," Julian said as she reached the center of the room. He didn't move to greet her. He waited for her to come to him, a power play so transparent it was almost pathetic. "I was just telling the board that we might have to start the presentation without the guest of honor." "The presentation hasn't even begun, Julian," she replied, her voice smooth and resonant, carrying easily to the witnesses now circling them. "And I would never miss the chance to see you in your element. You've always been so talented at performance." Julian's eyes narrowed, his smile faltering for a fraction of a second. He leaned in closer, the scent of his heavy sandalwood cologne clashing with the delicate florals of the room. "You can keep the mask on for the guests if you like, but we both know that by midnight, I'll be signing the papers that move your office into the basement, if I even let you keep a desk." This was the second spike, a direct, whispered threat in the middle of a celebration. "Is that what you think happens tonight?" Cassandra asked, her eyebrows arching in mock curiosity. She turned her gaze to Marcus Reed, who looked as if he might vibrate out of his skin. "Marcus, you look pale. Is the champagne not to your liking, or is it the weight of the secrets you're keeping for our vice president?" Marcus choked on a sip of wine, coughing into his hand. Julian stepped in front of him, physically blocking Cassandra's line of sight. "Leave him alone. You're finished, Cassandra. Enjoy the party. It's the last one you'll ever attend in this building." "We'll see," she said, her smile widening just enough to be dangerous. "The night is young, and the truth has a funny way of demanding the spotlight." She walked past him, her shoulder brushing his with a deliberate lack of concern. She made her way toward the front of the room, where a massive digital screen displayed the Vance International logo. She felt the eyes of the room on her, the doubt of the board, the hunger of the rivals, and the quiet, steady gaze of Beatrice from the balcony. Julian took his place at the podium a few minutes later, tapping the microphone. The sound echoed through the hall like a gavel. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice booming with unearned authority. "Tonight, we celebrate the past, but more importantly, we embrace a future unburdened by the shadows of the old ways. I have a special presentation prepared, a look at the new Vance International under my leadership." Cassandra stood at the edge of the stage, her hand resting on the cool metal of the control console. She looked at Julian, who was grinning at the crowd, basking in the light of the projector. He thought he was about to show a vision of his new empire. He didn't realize that Leo had already swapped the file. "Wait for it," she whispered to herself, the words lost in the applause. The lights in the ballroom dimmed to a soft, expectant glow. The screen behind Julian flickered, ready to display the first slide of his grand plan. Julian turned, his chest puffed out, ready to narrate his victory. Cassandra's heart beat a steady, rhythmic pulse against her ribs. One click. That was all it would take. The countdown in her head hit 0 just as the first image appeared on the screen. Not a corporate logo, but a high-resolution scan of a forged bank transfer with Julian Thorne's digital signature glowing in the dark. Julian's smile didn't vanish immediately. It froze, a grotesque mask of confusion as he stared at the evidence of his own crime, displayed for every major shareholder in the city to see. "What is this?" someone shouted from the front row. Cassandra stepped into the light, her face a mask of cold, unrelenting justice. "Yes, Julian," she said, her voice amplified by the secondary mic she had hidden in her corsage. "Why don't you tell the room exactly what we're looking at?" The silence that followed Cassandra's question was heavy, pressing against the eardrums of every socialite and shareholder in the ballroom. The sharp, ozone scent of the overworked projector bulb filled the air, mingling with the expensive floral arrangements that now felt like funeral wreaths. Julian Thorne didn't move. He looked like a statue carved from ice mid-shatter. Julian's features didn't just drop, they seemed to liquefy under the harsh glow of the evidence. The arrogant curve of his jaw slackened, leaving his mouth hanging open in a silent, jagged O that made him look suddenly, pathetically frail. The high color that usually flushed his cheeks from years of entitlement and expensive scotch drained away in an instant, replaced by a sickly, grayish pallor that highlighted the beads of cold sweat erupting along his hairline. His eyes, once darting with predatory confidence, grew wide and glassy, fixed on the glowing digital signature of the forged bank transfer as if staring directly into the sun. His chest hitched, his breathing turning into shallow, frantic rattles that barely seemed to reach his lungs, while his hands gripped the edge of the mahogany podium, so hard his knuckles turned the color of bleached bone. "It's a fabrication," Julian finally managed to choke out, though his voice lacked its usual resonance, sounding thin and reedy. He looked toward the front row, his eyes pleading. "Beatrice, surely you see this for what it is. A disgruntled employee's desperate attempt at character assassination." Beatrice Vance didn't flinch. She sat with her spine a rod of tempered iron, her hands folded over the silver head of her cane. Her eyes narrowed with a lethal, quiet disappointment that carried more weight than a physical blow. Beside her, Marcus Reed visibly recoiled. He didn't just look away. He physically slid his chair several inches to the right, putting distance between himself and the man he had spent months enabling. The movement was small, but in the vacuum of the room, it felt like a landslide. "The logs don't lie, Julian," Cassandra said, her voice amplified by the hidden microphone, steady and surgical. She stepped further into the light, the rhythmic, hollow thud of her heels on the stage sounding like the ticking of a countdown clock. "Leo Sterling spent 3 weeks tracing the encrypted routing numbers you thought were invisible. Every cent you diverted from the Vance estate to your offshore accounts is mapped out right there." In the back of the room, Leo stood by the shadows of the service entrance. He wasn't in his maintenance uniform tonight. He wore a sharp, dark suit that fit his frame with military precision. He simply nodded once, a silent confirmation of the digital trap he had helped her set. Julian's panic shifted into a desperate, cornered rage. "And who is going to believe a technician and a woman who is barely holding onto her seat? I built this expansion. I am the face of this firm." He slammed his fist onto the podium, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "You are nothing without my vision." "Your vision was a hallucination built on theft," Cassandra countered. She reached into the pocket of her tailored blazer and pulled out a single, cream-colored envelope. She didn't open it. She just held it up, the weight of the secret power within it palpable. "I didn't just audit the accounts, Julian. I audited the bylaws. You spent so much time looking down at me that you forgot to check who actually holds the keys to the kingdom." The room remained breathless as she walked toward Beatrice. The matriarch reached out, her rings catching the light, and took the envelope. She scanned the contents for only a moment before looking up at the man on the stage. "The board has already seen the documents, Julian," Beatrice announced, her voice brittle and final. "As of 4 o'clock this afternoon, your shares have been frozen pending a criminal investigation. You are no longer an officer of this company. In fact, you are no longer a guest in this building." The sound of collective gasps rippled through the audience. 2 security guards, large and expressionless, appeared at the wings of the stage. Julian looked at them, then back at the sea of faces, people who had laughed at his jokes and sought his favor only an hour ago. Now they looked at him with the cold curiosity one might afford a car wreck. Cassandra leaned in close to the microphone one last time, her gaze fixed on Julian's crumbling expression. "You once told me I didn't belong in a room like this." "You were right. I don't belong in a room filled with thieves." She turned her back on him before he could respond, the cold, metallic taste of victory finally settling on her tongue. She didn't stay to watch them escort him out. She didn't need to see the struggle or hear the excuses. As she walked down the steps and toward the exit, The shareholders parted for her like the Red Sea, their faces a blur of newfound respect and terror. She reached the heavy oak doors, pushed them open, and stepped out into the night air, leaving the wreckage of Julian Thorne's life behind her in the silence. The night air was a sharp, biting contrast to the suffocating heat of the boardroom. Cassandra Vance stood on the wide stone steps of the estate, her lungs finally expanding as the scent of damp cedar and approaching rain washed over her. Behind her, the heavy oak doors groaned open again, the sound of frantic, uneven footsteps echoing against the marble foyer before spilling out into the darkness. "You think this is over?" The voice was jagged, stripped of its usual polished baritone. She didn't turn around. She didn't have to. She knew the sound of Julian Thorne's desperation better than he knew it himself. He descended the stairs 2 at a time, his silk tie loosened and his jacket flapping open like the broken wings of a grounded bird. He moved into her peripheral vision, his shadow stretching long and distorted under the amber glow of the porch lights. "That was a stunt, Cassandra. A pathetic, desperate play for attention," he spat, his breath hitching. He reached out as if to grab her shoulder but stopped inches away, his hand trembling in the cold air. "You can't just walk in there with a few doctored spreadsheets and think the world is going to stop turning. I have friends. I have contracts. I have a legacy that you couldn't touch in 100 years. "You have a debt, Julian," she said, her voice a calm, low vibration that seemed to cut through his frantic energy. "And tonight the interest came due." She pulled a slim, silver device from her evening bag, the burner phone Leo Sterling had provided. She didn't look at the screen, she simply tapped a button. Across the circular driveway, the headlights of a parked black sedan flickered to life, cutting through the gloom. Julian Thorne's face didn't just pale. It seemed to lose its very structure, the skin sagging as if the bones beneath had turned to ash. His left eye developed a frantic, rhythmic twitch that he couldn't control, while his mouth hung open in a jagged, silent O. The arrogant flush that usually defined his features was replaced by a sickly, grayish translucence, and beads of oily sweat broke out across his forehead, matting his expensive hair into clumps. He looked less like a man and more like a discarded mask, hollowed out by the sudden, crushing weight of his own consequences. His chest heaved, but the air seemed to stop in his throat, leaving him gasping like a fish pulled from the safety of deep water. The rear door of the sedan opened, and Beatrice Vance stepped out. She moved with the slow, terrifying grace of a predator that had already won. Her cane clicked against the pavement, a rhythmic, final sound that made the man beside Cassandra flinch. "The legacy you mentioned, Julian," Beatrice said, her eyes like chips of flint. "It was never yours to claim. You were a steward of a house you didn't build, and you chose to burn the furniture for warmth." "Beatrice, listen to me," he started, his voice cracking into a high, thin whine. "Reed can explain. Marcus, tell her." He turned toward the doors, expecting his shadow to emerge. Marcus Reed did step out, but he didn't move to Julian's side. He stopped several feet away, clutching a leather briefcase to his chest as if it were a shield. His eyes wouldn't meet his former master's. "I gave them the encryption keys, Julian," Marcus whispered, his voice trembling but certain. "I gave them the logs for the Cayman accounts, all of them." The betrayal hit the younger man with the force of a physical blow. He staggered back, his heel catching on the edge of a stone step. For a second, he looked as though he might tumble into the darkness of the manicured bushes. "You rat!" Julian hissed, the word landing weakly in the vast silence of the night. "I made you. I gave you everything." "You gave me a front row seat to a crime," Marcus replied, finally looking up. "I'm just making sure I'm not in the car when it hits the wall." Cassandra watched the exchange with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a chemical reaction. The rage that had fueled her for months had settled into something colder and much more permanent. She felt the weight of the evidence in her bag, the final documents Leo had secured, and knew that by morning, the name Thorne would be synonymous with nothing but a cautionary tale. "The authorities are waiting at the gate, Julian," Cassandra said. She reached out and adjusted his lapel, a mocking gesture of care that made him recoil as if she'd burned him. "I'd suggest you use what's left of your dignity to walk down the driveway. It would be a shame to have the neighbors see you in handcuffs." He looked at her then, and for the first time the entitlement was gone. In its place was a hollow, echoing vacuum of fear. He looked at the house, the lights, and the women standing before him, realizing that the world he had tried to steal had already moved on without him. "You'll regret this," he whispered, though even he didn't seem to believe it. "I've spent 5 years regretting trusting you," she replied, stepping toward the waiting car. "Tonight is the first night I feel like I have nothing left to regret at all." She didn't wait for him to respond. She didn't stay to watch the security guards, who were already moving toward him from the shadows of the foyer. She climbed into the back of the sedan beside Beatrice. As the car began to roll forward, the tires crunching over the expensive gravel, Cassandra looked out the window. In the rearview mirror, she saw the silhouette of a man standing alone on the steps of a kingdom that no longer belonged to him. The first heavy drops of rain began to fall, blurring the image until he was nothing more than a dark smudge against the light. She turned her head away, looking forward into the dark, wet road, and felt the engine hum beneath her, a steady, powerful rhythm that promised a future where his name was never spoken again. 6 months later, the spring air in the city felt crisp, carrying the faint, clean scent of rain and blooming jasmine. Cassandra Vance sat behind the desk in the corner office, the one that had once belonged to her father, and then, briefly, to the man who had tried to dismantle her life. The mahogany surface was cool beneath her palms, polished to a mirror finish that reflected the clear blue sky outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. The silence of the executive suite was broken by the rhythmic click of the door. Leo Sterling walked in, no longer wearing the grease-stained coveralls of a maintenance man. He looked sharp in a charcoal suit, his posture relaxed but his eyes as observant as ever. Behind him, Maya skipped into the room, her laughter a bright, silver sound that felt foreign yet welcome in a place that had seen so much cold calculation. "The final audit is complete," Leo said, placing a leather-bound folder on the desk. He leaned against the chair, watching as Maya busied herself with a set of architectural models on the side table. "Marcus Reed took the plea deal. He's currently working in a suburban accounting firm 3 states away, living in a studio apartment and checking his shoulder every time a black sedan passes by. He'll be testifying against the remaining board members for the next 2 years." Cassandra flipped open the folder. Her eyes skimmed the liquidation reports. The numbers were absolute. The Thorne family assets had been systematically dismantled to pay back the diverted funds and the mounting legal fees of a man who still refused to believe the world didn't owe him a throne. "And Julian?" she asked, her voice steady. Leo hesitated for a moment, then pulled a small, grainy photograph from his pocket. "He was spotted this morning. He didn't qualify for the executive wing of the state program, and the civil suit stripped him of the last of the trust fund." Cassandra looked at the photo. Julian Thorne was standing on a sun-bleached sidewalk, wearing a uniform that was 2 sizes too large. He was holding a microfiber cloth, standing next to a gleaming silver Mercedes at a high-end car wash in the valley. His face was gaunt, the arrogant smirk replaced by a hollow, frantic look as he scrubbed the rims of a car he could no longer afford to ride in. He was surrounded by the very people he had once called the help, yet he was the one struggling to keep pace. "He tried to argue with a customer yesterday about the quality of the wax," Leo added quietly. "The manager told him to shut up or go home. He stayed." Cassandra closed the folder. The face slap wasn't a single moment anymore. It was the slow, agonizing weight of every morning he had to wake up and realize he was exactly who he had always feared being, unimportant. The man who had mocked her for her modest life was now fighting for tips from people who didn't even know his name. Later that afternoon, Cassandra stood in the foyer of the Vance family estate. The house was hers again, but it felt different. Beatrice Vance sat by the fireplace, the light of the dying embers catching the sharp lines of her face. The matriarch looked older, the regal mask slipping to reveal the exhaustion beneath. "You've restored the name," Beatrice said, her voice a dry rasp. "The company is stronger than it has been in a decade. You should be proud, Cassandra." "I am," she replied, though the word felt heavy. "But I'm also tired, Beatrice." She looked around the grand room. The cost of her victory was etched into the silence between them. She had saved the empire, but she had lost the illusion of family. The trust she had once held for her kin had been burned away, replaced by the cold, hard steel of a CEO who knew that even the people sharing her blood were capable of the deepest betrayals. Her mother's pearls felt cold against her throat, a reminder of a legacy that required a certain kind of ruthlessness to survive. Leo appeared in the doorway, Maya holding his hand. The girl waved a small drawing she had made, a colorful, messy sun rising over a house. "Ready to go?" Leo asked. Cassandra looked at Beatrice, then at the child whose life she had helped secure. She stood up, her heels clicking with a final, decisive sound against the marble floor. She didn't look back as she walked toward the light of the open front door. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long, golden shadows across the gravel driveway. Cassandra Vance stepped into the waiting car, the engine humming a steady, powerful rhythm. She had won. The kingdom was hers, the enemy was broken, and the truth was undisputed. But as the gates of the estate closed behind her, she realized that the most satisfying part of the revenge wasn't the power she had regained. It was the fact that for the first time in 5 years, she didn't have to think about Julian Thorne at all.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.